This is, to put it mildly, a drastic overinterpretation. That is because the design of the experiment makes it effectively irrelevant for the question of free will. The participants made an active and deliberate decision when they agreed to take part in the study and to follow the instructions of the researcher. Those instructions explicitly told them to act on a whim, to let the urge to act appear on its own at any time without any pre-planning or concentration on when to act. They had no reason to want to move their hand more at one point than another because nothing was at stake. And so, it seems they did indeed act on a whim. They decided to let subconscious processes in their brains decide by drawing on inherent random fluctuations in neural activity. Because EEG data capture lots of ongoing brain activity not related to the movement, it is necessary to average across many traces to see the tiny signal that represents the readiness potential. The way Libet and colleagues did that was to take data for individual events, every time the subject moved a finger, and align those traces at that point of movement and then average across them. Looking backward at the averaged time-locked brain activity preceding the movements, they could then see the readiness potential as a steadily ramping signal. The signal is thus only apparent retrospectively. It is not actually predictive of movement. The interpretation, however, was that the onset of this signal, when it first starts to creep up above baseline, represents the point at which the brain decides to make a movement, and that the subsequent increasing activity represents the process of preparing the movement, culminating in its execution. However, there's a very different way of looking at these data, developed by Aaron Scherger and his colleagues, which is consistent with a totally different interpretation of what is going on, that the organism is making use of ongoing random fluctuations to guide the utterly inconsequential choice of when to move. When the EEG recordings are time-locked to an externally cued event, a click instructing the person to move as quickly as possible, the signal clearly fluctuates noisily up and down all the time. Sometimes it goes back down again, and the person does not move. Other times it happens to reach a threshold, and then a movement is initiated. In Scherger's experiment, if the activity level happened to be nearer the threshold when the person was cued to act, then their reaction times were shorter. These data strongly suggest that the choice uses the same kind of self-reinforcing evidence accumulation process for normal decision-making, but because nothing is at stake, the subjects allow the process to be driven by random fluctuations. In this interpretation, the commitment to move is made much later, only when the threshold has been reached and exactly within the time window when subjects report becoming consciously aware of such an intention. This means that the readiness potential is not in fact a signal of the intention to move that occurs long before subjective awareness, but rather is an artifact of the way the data are analyzed. A strong prediction of this model is that the readiness potential should not be observed in scenarios where subjects are making a decision that actually matters to them and that they deliberate over. Yuri Mao's Liad Mudrik and colleagues recently tested that idea in an elegant experiment where subjects had to decide the amount of money to give to two charities. In half the presentations, the decision had no consequence. Both charities received $500. But in the other half, the chosen charity received $1,000 and the other got nothing. The charities were selected for each subject from among a set that included those the subjects cared about, giving them an incentive to choose one over another. The results were very clear. In the trials where the decision was arbitrary, a readiness potential was detected. That is, the movement of the left or right hand was associated with random fluctuations that raised the activity in the premotor cortex above the threshold for initiating a movement. But in the trials where the subjects made a deliberative, consequential choice, no such association was found. Presumably, the subjects were processing information elsewhere in the brain as they were considering the option, and then movement was triggered on that basis. Overall, then, Libet's experiments have very little relevance for the question of free will. They do not relate to deliberative decisions at all, where the readiness potential is not observed. Instead, they confirm, first, that neural activity in the brain is not completely deterministic, and second, that organisms can choose to harness the inherent randomness to make arbitrary decisions in a timely fashion. It is likely that we do this all the time, without being aware of it, precisely because that process relates to all kinds of little actions we take that are of no consequence. But there is another type of scenario where neural variability can be drawn on that is arguably more relevant for the question of free will and agent causality. It occurs not at the stage of choosing between options, but when suggesting them. Two-stage models of free will. In Chapter 6, we talked about options of what to do springing to mind. In any given scenario, an animal has a limited set of ideas of what to do, based on its action repertoire, its past experience, its current goals, and its evolutionary imperatives. This limiting of options is the crucial payoff of all the learning the animal has been doing, and is essential for rapid, efficient, optimal decision-making. It means that the organism doesn't have to start from first principles, with an enormous search space of options in every situation it finds itself in. But what determines which options spring to mind? If the scenario is very familiar, like our morning routines, then one particular behavioral option may be so well worn as to have become habitual. In other cases, there may be a small set of previously used options that arise that are then adjudicated. Think of your possible responses when someone says good morning to you. So, the options we consider, the ones that even occur to us, are highly informed by our prior experience. But even in familiar scenarios, the particular ideas that bubble up to the surface may also be influenced by the inherent noisiness of the relevant neural circuits. They are unlikely to be exactly the same every time you were in any given situation. Indeed, given the variability we've been discussing, it's hard to see how they ever could be exactly the same in every detail. This notion is central to what is known as the two-stage model of free will, proposed by the American psychologist and philosopher William James in